I'm here with Achim Steiner. He's head of the United Nations Development Program. Achim, thank you so much for being here. This is your last interview before you leave. How's Davos been for you this week?
I think on the one hand, intense as it always is, because in a few days you have an opportunity to meet with an extraordinary range of people. As the United Nations Development Program, we work across the whole world, so this is an opportunity for some key strategic discussions. At the same time, I think to some extent also concerned, because the theme of this year was fragmentation in the world, and indeed I think what we see is a world fragmenting, and in many ways drifting apart. And the United Nations Secretary General, during his speech here in Davos, also appealed to the world to not let competition and conflict define the pathway forward from the current crisis.
Now, untypically, the last Davos took place just 6 months ago in May. How have global concerns changed since then?
I think they have become more serious. I think in some ways the situation has deteriorated. Take, for instance, the conflict, the war in Ukraine. I think the suffering, the sheer destruction that is occurring there continues day after day. But at the same time, there are many other conflicts, many other crises across the world. As UNDP, we are concerned, for instance, about the debt problem and the challenge that many developing countries face right now on the back of COVID, and now having to address a cost of living crisis, a debt problem. Their ability to actually operate as economies is being severely impacted by the global economic outlook and the prospect of a recession. So, tough times.
As you said, Ukraine is a major focus at the forum this year, but to some degree less so than last time. What do you think about this? Is that appropriate?
Look, I think the world remains very focused on the conflict and what also are avenues for not letting that conflict, in a sense, allow us to lose sight of the fact that we are 8 billion people on this planet. We have a climate crisis, we have a cost of living crisis, we have conflicts in Yemen, on the continent of Africa. These are also crises that need to have our attention. So the challenge is not to trade off one against the other, but rather to look at some of the underlying levers that we have for helping a world come out of crisis, out of conflict, and begin to invest in people and development again. Because what is really striking in the world out there today is that sense of insecurity, a lack of perspective and hope. And I think this is in part feeding off the current crisis, but it's also seeding the next crisis.
Now, after Russia invaded Ukraine, a lot of criticism was thrown at the UN, people essentially calling it ineffective in some ways. What do you think this war has taught the UN about what it's capable of, but also about its limitations?
Well, first of all, I think what we have seen, particularly in the context of Ukraine, but frankly, we have seen it during the Cold War, and we are seeing it in other conflicts also, is that the United Nations, as conceived after the Second World War, and in particular the Security Council, is probably emblematic for the need to evolve the instruments that were established for, in a sense, protecting the peace, for avoiding conflict, but also the instruments we have, the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the UN. We are all under scrutiny because are we able to actually put forward the responses that are needed in these moments of crisis? They're not always as a result of war. Climate change, the cataclysmic floods of 2022 in Pakistan, 1/3 of the country inundated. The UN just, together with the government of Pakistan, organized a climate conference about Pakistan and its reconstruction. This is a generational task that Pakistan is facing right now, and again, we need international support. So yes, we are seeing the limitations of the United Nations, of its political organs. We're also seeing, let me be very frank, many wealthy countries walking away from their ability to actually support developing countries in this moment of crisis, turning inward, focusing more on themselves. That also erodes multilateralism.
Now, you mentioned earlier the problem of inflation. We're seeing cost of living crises in both richer and poorer nations. What would you say to people who feel that their country needs to take care of its own citizens first, instead of looking at development in other countries?
I would answer it in two ways. First of all, taking care of your neighbor sometimes takes care of yourself. I think that's a simple logic that we can experience in our lives, and I think we can see it also in a world that essentially depends on others addressing their emissions in order to protect your own future. It helps us to address cybercrime. It helps us to also address, for instance, a phenomenon that we're observing right now in this context of a global recession. Many developing countries are at the receiving end of inflationary pressures driving up interest rates in the global economic centers. Through no fault of their own, no action of their own, they are suddenly put in a situation where they may have not the funds to service their debt anymore. Imagine economies defaulting. We saw it in Sri Lanka. These are catastrophic events. And therefore, I think a second reason why we have a G20 and why we have a Bretton Woods system is that we know we're all safer if we respond together to these crises. And I think we are seeing at the moment a lack of that appreciation, that lack of perspective. Domestic politics is always going to be a pressure cooker. But it is also the role of politicians not simply to yield to the domestic political debate when their role is to ensure that their citizens are protected in a world in which we have to live together. We depend on one another to address the great risks to our future.
I also wanted to ask you about this issue of debt service repayment. Many developing countries have stopped investing in things like education and health services in order to pay back loans to richer countries. What needs to be done about this?
Well, first of all, to recognize how dramatic the situation is. UNDP's latest estimate is that 51 developing countries are in a situation of debt distress. That means one step away from default. To the world's financial markets, that reads as well, they cover 2 to 4% of global GDP. Are they really a threat to our financial system? But when I tell you as a development organization, that's 12% of the world's population, it's 30% of the world's poor, you suddenly begin to get a very different view. So, as the UN Secretary General has also done repeatedly, he's calling for the G20 and the international financial system to step up, inject liquidity, restructure debt, also combine the debt restructuring with investments in acting on climate change and addressing in particular the sustainable development goals. We have to recover together. We have to invest at this moment, asking people who have no more funds left in their public coffers, who are already stressed by the pandemic, to ask them to suddenly find money when you're actually raising the cost of borrowing is lacking imagination. In fact, it's condemning the poorest to paying the highest price for crises that they certainly didn't cause, but they're now actually having to survive in.
Now, we've been talking about a lot of major economic issues weighing on the globe. We've also seen significant global economic slowdown in the last couple years due to the pandemic, due to the war in Ukraine. Do you think that ESG and green financing initiatives will allow us to regain the growth that shareholders are used to seeing in the global economy? Or do you think it would make more sense in this landscape to embrace an economic model of degrowth, for example? What are your thoughts?
I think for mature economies, the notion of a degrowth paradigm becomes perhaps a more realistic proposition, because you're essentially already living in a world, for example, in Europe, where in much of the last decade and a half, economies grew by 1 or 2%. It's in the developing world where still basic infrastructure, basic services, education, the investments in the future ability to industrialize, to have access to energy, will require economies to grow. So what we have to first of all focus on is, can we decouple economic growth from the destruction that has been so central to the 20th century paradigm of growth? Treating nature, treating pollution, treating the atmosphere as dumping grounds as if they have no impact on our collective well-being. That is at the frontier, I think, of rethinking our economies. And here, financial markets are failing us right now. We still see much of the investments that are happening in the world's financial markets investing in yesterday's economy, in full knowledge and in full sight of the fact that it is precisely that infrastructure, that ecological footprint, that is going to ruin the future for our children. We have to reset that through regulatory frameworks, through incentives, but also through responsible leadership. And, you know, the Secretary General yesterday, when he addressed the World Economic Forum, also reminded the world that some of the major oil companies in 1977 were already publishing the scientific analysis that we took another 20 years to, in a sense, socialize in the broader public policy debate, that fossil fuels were going to drive us to the precipice. The same is true in so many other respects. A world of $400 trillion, those are essentially the numbers that summarize our global wealth, being invested in essentially technologies of the past instead of the pathways of the future, are going to undermine our collective well-being and our economies. So call it ESG, call it green financing, blue financing. As UNDP, we are heavily invested now in helping countries to leverage the capital markets with SDG bonds, with sustainability-linked performance bonds. Those are ways in which we can leverage private capital for both, in a sense, a return to investors, but also for the public good. And I think the future of financial markets will in part be premised on being able to turn what seemingly is a contradiction into actually a value proposition.
We're talking here about climate change. Here at Davos, we've talked about climate change, food insecurity, energy crisis, cost of living crisis, the war in Ukraine. It's a lot of issues the globe is taking on right now. Do you think that we are capable of bringing these things back under control, or is it a matter of adapting to a new normal?
Absolutely. And, you know, in the midst of all of these crises, there are extraordinary things happening. I mean, we are in an energy crisis, energy security moment in which some people think maybe we are going to go back to the hydrocarbons era of the past. But look to India. In India right now, there is a remarkable energy revolution unfolding, with India investing in constructing 450,000 megawatts of renewable energy infrastructure by the year 2030, largely funded through good regulatory frameworks by the private sector. And I could give you many other examples that, in fact, the future is being invented every day across the globe. The question is, can we have a global economy and a global family of nations not define globalization, but simply a sort of limitless license for growth, but actually investing in the kind of infrastructure and the kind of societies that allow us to thrive together. And I think there are many reasons why we should be extremely worried about the shocks we are seeing unfold right now. They are profound and sometimes are not even appreciated, because we can talk about a recession. What it means is hundreds of millions of people perhaps losing their jobs, fathers and mothers not being able to have food on the table, not being able to send their daughters to school. Those are the true stories of a global recession. And unfortunately, when we are in Davos, the reality of those people feature more as a statistic rather than a reality that would help us all to appreciate that our responsibility to act differently is actually very visible if you look outside the window.
Achim Steiner of the UN Development Program, thank you so much.
Thank you.